Welcome. We have a great evening planned. And before we get to our speaker tonight, I'm Lee Cranberg. I'm making the financial pitch. This evening is being co-sponsored by the Boston Society of Neurology and Psychiatry and the Massachusetts General Hospital Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior. And for us to continue to have evenings like this with scintillating speakers and refreshments, we need dues-paying members. And our funds are very low right now. We don't receive any kind of corporate or pharmaceutical support. The Boston Society of Neurology and Psychiatry gets by strictly on the dues and support of its members. So we're going to be a little bit heavy-handed about this tonight. I'm going to pass out membership applications, and then Sherita and I are going to be at the exit at the end of the evening. And we'll take checks, credit cards, PayPal. We're an equal opportunity vendor. So without further ado, Bruce Price. I'm going to hand the meeting over to Bruce.
So Travis Tierney, a neurosurgeon here at the Brigham, was initially supposed to give you a beautiful, wonderful, lavish introduction. He's a neurosurgeon here, and he's in neurosurgery as we speak on an emergency case. So he has given me his script, if I may read. This is in the words of Travis. It's a great pleasure to introduce Steven Pinker. Bruce Price, that's me, asked me to give a brief bio sketch. I'll then turn the floor over to him to introduce the topic of Steven's talk and set some contextual ideas out for us to think about tonight. And here's his, this works, I think, Louis, we'll see. Like all great American intellectuals, Steven Pinker is actually a Canadian. Born in Montreal, attended McGill, did his PhD with Stephen Kosslyn. I didn't know that. Where he studied the mental imagery of shapes, establishing the idea that objects are not seen in the mind as a Platonic three-dimensional image, but rather from a particular two-dimensional perspective. Dr. Pinker then went on to study various aspects of language and has, this is his words, more or less bounced back and forth between MIT and Harvard for most of his career. But I believe you're the Johnstone professor at Harvard. And so with that, I give you Bruce Price. Now on to my introduction. So pardon my laryngitis, but I think I can make it through this brief introduction. So our Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior is very interested in your talk, Steven, tonight, because we need advice. Here's the problem as we see it. It's never been more important for the public to understand science. So witness the anti-science attacks in response to global warming. Corollary to that is it's never been more important for scientists to effectively communicate with and educate the public. So in our CLBB group, as scientists, clinicians, and lawyers, the predominance of people who are here, we need to know, how do we do this? How do we effectively communicate with the public? How do we tell a compelling science story? And how do we shift previously held, strongly held opinions about public perceptions and policy per se? So our CLBB mission is to promote the translation and application of brain science into law, policy, and finance in a sound, ethical, and responsible manner, which eventually transforms society. Our motto, our clarion call is, the brain matters, science matters, justice matters. So that's a brief introduction to where we're coming from. So let me define, if I can find the right, and maybe someone needs to help me out here. Hold on. Yeah, well, I did that, yeah. So let me define part of the problem. Boardroom, yes, Peters, it's just legalese. It's all just legalese. Of course, for Christ's sake, we're a law firm. So either by predisposition and or training, I think scientists, clinicians, lawyers, other professionals, we build silos. And we tend to burrow down very deeply in our own rabbit holes. So for instance, I was told, at least during my medical school days in the 1970s, that the new medical students were introduced to 17,000 new terms in 1 year. And in part, you understand that's good, and it's all based in Greek and Latin. But it also begins to develop a very specialized vocabulary. And more important than that, almost a specialized subculture from which we can't really communicate beyond our silo, beyond our rabbit hole very well. And this speaks to where we stand at the CLBB. Now, the part of the cross-training of the CLBB is it's actually the joy of discovery and fun. So Randy Buckner, who's a world-renowned neuroimager, until last year when he developed and joined our board, did not know that an amicus brief project was how you change the law. I've just learned 2 new terms in this very week, CLBB related. Mechanic Turk. Did I say it? Mechanical Turk. Now, anyone I believe 40 years or younger knows that. They say, aha. For those of you above that, after this, turn and ask people what Mechanical Turk is. Second thing I learned just yesterday, and this is not my language, but the language of the website, you realize that there is a website that says, I fucking love science. And it has 20 million readers. Ponder that. And so, our organization's had success with the usual review articles, some original articles, some chapters. But we're struggling with letters to the editors and op-ed pieces. So it's difficult for us. Now, we think we should be writing weekly. The adolescent brain, addiction, crime, cognitive impairment, elder scams, witness identity, memory issues in the courtroom. But we have had modest success. But here is our attempt to try to understand the problem and address it. And this is from Mr. Fair, who's the letters editor of the New York Times, queried those writers whom he designated as the regulars. We have friends who are one of the 15 most regularly published letters to the editors, people, and he relayed this on us. As he said, letters who are especially clear and cogent, bettering their odds of being selected for publication in the highly subjective winnowing process. And the key words which we're trying to understand and employ: timeliness is a must, brevity will improve your chances, stylishness and wit will win my heart. Here's our analysis. In our CLBB, we tend to be, I would say, obsessive. I would say perfectionistic and cautious. Cautious seems to be built into the system. And so what we do, when we write these things, we feel there's too much to say in too little space, and with God knows, too little time. So this is the cramp that we're involved in, and how can we weekly put out things left and right that have some meaning. The last 2 op-eds we submitted by brilliant writers, I must say, were summarily rejected. So we need to step up and get better on this. What we want to do, if I can now, oh yeah, right, wow, the slides are ahead of me. We want to understand Picasso's mind and the imaginative creativity when he started in the upper left with a complex drawing of a bull down to the middle and the bottom, how he is still simple, elegant, eloquent, and keeps on theme. So we're hoping that you can follow Picasso in this way, and that we can then follow you. And this is actually a chunked up version of something other that's bigger called the Bull by Picasso, for those of you that follow this. So finally, we have questions for you, Steve, and they are as follows. We're interested in the process of you as a really lovely communicator of science to the public, as a wildly popular lecturer, so I hear, and as a publisher of best-selling books. So that we come to you tonight with some envy and with some desire to really learn how you hit the mark routinely. So our questions are, how do you write so uncommonly well? How do you choose your topic, your audience? How do you get inspired? How do you exercise discipline? Another new CLBB friend who writes science says it's simple for him. He rewards himself after 2 hours of really good manuscript writing. He goes downstairs and he takes a trip to Ben and Jerry's and comes back. And this is a psychologist, so you have to understand kind of the carrot approach to this. And what is your reward system? And finally, how do you find the time to write and read so widely? And yes, please tell us about your sense of style. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that very kind and lavish introduction. And I will get to some of your specific questions perhaps during the Q&A. But first, I'd like to begin with a question. Why is so much writing so bad? And how can we make it better? Excuse me. Why do we have to endure so much legalese, as in the revocation by these regulations of a provision previously revoked subject to savings does not affect the continued operations? Why do we have to put up with academies, as in it is the moment of non-construction, disclosing the absentation of actuality from the concept, in part through its invitation to emphasize in reading the helplessness of its fall into conceptuality? Why is it so hard to set the time on a digital alarm clock? Well, there's no shortage of theories, and probably the most popular one is captured in this cartoon. The boss says to the tech writer, "Good start, needs more gibberish." That is, that bad writing is a deliberate choice. Bureaucrats insist on gibberish to evade responsibility. It's the revenge of the nerds. Pasty-faced tech writers get their revenge on the girls who turned them down for dates in high school and the jocks who kicked sand in their faces. Pseudo-intellectuals try to bamboozle their readers with highfalutin gobbledygook, disguising the fact that they have nothing to say. Well, I have no doubt that the bamboozlement theory is true of some writers some of the time, but as a general explanation, it doesn't ring true to me, because good people can write bad prose. I know plenty of scientists and scholars who do groundbreaking research on important topics. They have nothing to hide and no need to impress, but still, their writing stinks. The second popular theory is that it's digital media that are ruining the language. Google is making us stupid. The digital age has given rise to the dumbest generation. Twitter is forcing us to write and think in 140 characters. Well, if the dumbest generation theory were true, then that would imply that it was much better before the digital age, such as the 1980s. Now, some of you were around in the 1980s, and you remember that those as the days when teenagers spoke in articulate paragraphs, right? And bureaucrats wrote in plain English. Every academic article was a masterpiece in the art of the essay. Or was it the 70s? Of course, bad writing has burdened readers in every generation, and every generation moans about the imminent decline of the language. In 1961, for example, you read the complaint, "Recent graduates, including those with university degrees, seem to have no mastery of the language at all." Well, maybe you have to go back before the era of radio and television, like 1917. When someone wrote, "From every college in the country goes up the cry, our freshmen can't spell, can't punctuate. Every high school is in disrepair because its pupils are so ignorant of the merest rudiments." Well, what about the European Enlightenment in the 18th century? Well, back then they were saying our language is degenerating very fast. I begin to fear that it will be impossible to check it. And then there are the ancient grammar police. Said, "Oh, for crying out loud, you never end a sentence with a little bird." A better theory, I think, comes from an observation by Charles Darwin that man has an instinctive tendency to speak, as we see in the babble of our young children, whereas no child has an instinctive tendency to bake, brew, or write. That is, whereas speech is instinctive, writing is and always has been hard. The reader is unknown, invisible, inscrutable. They really exist only in the writer's imagination. The reader can't react or break in or ask for clarification. And so writing, above all, is an act of pretense, and writing is an act of craftsmanship. So what can we do to improve the craft of writing? For many decades, this question had a standard answer, and that is that you hand the aspiring writer this, the iconic Elements of Style by William Strunk Jr. and E.B. White, who also known as the beloved New Yorker columnist and author of the children's classics Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little. And notice, by the way, that the junior member of this pair was born before the turn of the century, that is, before the turn of the 20th century. Well, there's no doubt that there is much good sense in the Elements of Style. Little gems of advice that actually exemplifies itself, like use definite, specific, concrete language, write with nouns and verbs, put the emphatic words at the end, and their prime directive, omit needless words, which is an excellent example of itself. On the other hand, there are many reasons why the Elements of Style can't be the sole basis of writing advice in the 21st century. For one thing, much of the advice is obsolete. For example, do not use the word to finalize. It's a pompous, ambiguous verb. Or to contact is vague and self-important. Do not contact people, get in touch with them, look them up, phone them, find them, or meet them. Now, it's hard to get worked up nowadays over these, by now, completely unexceptionable verbs. In fact, they're indispensable. Sometimes you really don't care how one person is going to get in touch with another as long as they do so. And, of course, they did not live to see the days of texting someone, emailing them, instant messaging them, and so on. These were neologisms in the days of Professor Strunk in the 19-teens, and he failed to cultivate an ear for ongoing change in the language, which is inexorable. Also, some of the advice is just baffling. For example, the word people is not to be used with words of number in place of persons. That is, you may not say or write 6 people. Why not? Well, if of 6 people, 5 went away, how many people would be left? Answer, 1 people. Did you get that? By the same logic, you shouldn't be able to say, I have 3 children, or 32 teeth. Or how about this one? Note that the word clever means one thing when applied to people, another when applied to horses. A clever horse is a good-natured one, not an ingenious one. The problem with traditional style advice is it consists of an arbitrary list of do's and don'ts based on the tastes and peeves of the authors. It does not come from a principled understanding of how language works, and as a result, users have no way of understanding and assimilating the advice, and much of the advice is just wrong. I think we can do better today. We can base advice on writing on the science and scholarship of language, on modern grammatical theory, which provides more insightful analyses of the language than the old pedagogical grammars based on Latin, on evidence-based dictionaries, on research from cognitive science on what makes sentences easy or hard to read, and on historical and critical studies of usage. And that's what I've tried to do in The Sense of Style. It all begins with a model of effective prose communication. As I mentioned, writing is an unnatural act. Good style requires, above all, a coherent mental model of the communication scenario. That is, how the writer imagines the absent reader and what the writer is trying to accomplish. And my favorite model of effective prose communication comes from a wonderful book called Clear and Simple as the Truth by the literary scholars Francis Noël Thomas and Mark Turner, and they call it classic style. The model behind classic style is that prose is a window onto the world. The writer has seen something in the world which the reader has not yet noticed. He positions the reader so that she can see it with her own eyes. The reader and writer are equals. The goal is to help the reader see objective reality, and the style is conversation. Now, that might sound fairly obvious, but classic style is only one of a number of styles that Thomas and Turner differentiate. They note that there's contemplative style, oracular style, practical style, but the one that enfeebles academic prose is one that they call postmodern or self-conscious style. in which the writer's chief, if unstated, concern is to escape being convicted of philosophical naivete about his own enterprise. They go on. When we open a cookbook, we completely put aside and expect the author to put aside the kind of question that leads to the heart of certain philosophical traditions. Is it possible to talk about cooking? Do eggs really exist? Is food something about which knowledge is possible? Can anyone tell us anything true about cooking? Classic style similarly puts aside as inappropriate philosophical questions about its enterprise. If it took those questions up, it could never get around to treating its subject, and its purpose is exclusively to treat its subject. Now, I would be betraying the ideals of classic style if I just described it to you without presenting an example, and so I will show you an example. This comes from an article by the physicist Brian Greene that appeared in Newsweek magazine on inflationary cosmology and multiple universes. Greene writes, "If space is now expanding, then at ever earlier times the universe must have been ever smaller. At some moment in the distant past, everything we now see, the ingredients responsible for every planet, every star, every galaxy, even space itself, must have been compressed to an infinitesimal speck that then swelled outward, evolving into the universe as we know it. The Big Bang Theory was born. Yet scientists were aware that the Big Bang Theory suffered from a significant shortcoming. Of all things, it leaves out the bang. Einstein's equations do a wonderful job of describing how the universe evolved from a split second after the bang, but the equations break down, similar to the error message returned by a calculator when you try to divide 1 by 0, when applied to the extreme environment of the universe's earliest moment. The Big Bang thus provides no insight into what might have powered the bang itself." Now, in this passage, Greene goes over some pretty complicated physics and cosmology, but he does it in a way that the reader can see for himself or herself. If we imagine the expanding universe, then we can run the mental movie backward and see why scientists posited the Big Bang. Namely, you go back far enough and it must have originated from a speck. And even the abstruse mathematical concept of equations breaking down is illustrated with an example that anyone can appreciate. You can either literally pull out a calculator and try to divide 1 by 0, and you see, lo and behold, it returns an error message. Or you can ponder what it could possibly mean to divide the number 1 into 0 parts. Either way, you can appreciate this concept of equations breaking down for yourself, and that's classic style. Many examples of writing advice turn out to be implications behind the single model behind classic prose. Foremost, the focus on classic prose is on the thing being shown, not on the activity of studying it. Now, in my professional life, and I'm sure in many of your professional lives, you all too often come across introductions to articles on research that begin more or less as follows. This is taken from my own field of research. In recent years, an increasing number of researchers have turned their attention to the problem of child language acquisition. In this article, recent theories of this process will be reviewed. Well, no offense, but not a whole lot of people are really that interested in how professors spend their time. A more classic introduction to the same paper could have been, all children acquire the ability to speak and understand a language without explicit lessons. How do they accomplish this feat? A corollary of this advice is to minimize the kind of apologizing that is de rigueur in academic prose. Again, I'll give you an example, this one a bit contrived from my own field, but all too representative. The problem of language acquisition is extremely complex. It is difficult to give precise definitions of the concept of language and the concept of acquisition and the concept of children. There is much uncertainty about the interpretation of experimental data and a great deal of controversy surrounding the theories. More research needs to be done. Now, this is the kind of paragraph that could just be deleted as a block with no loss of content. Because classic prose gives the reader credit for knowing that many concepts are hard to define and many controversies are hard to resolve. The reader is there to see what the writer's going to do about it. Another corollary is to minimize hedging. Many scholars feel that they have to drizzle their prose almost at random with softeners like somewhat, fairly, rather, nearly, relatively, seemingly, in part, comparatively, predominantly, apparently, so to speak, presumably, as if to imply that they don't really mean anything that they say. I'll give you a similar kind of defensiveness comes from the use of shutter quotes, by which a writer will try to distance himself from a common idiom. And I'll give you an example. This is a real example from a letter of recommendation that I recently received. She is a, quote, quick study, unquote, and has been able to educate herself in virtually any area that interests her. Now, are we supposed to interpret this as saying that this young woman is a quick study, or that this young woman is a quick study, namely someone who is maybe alleged or rumored to be a quick study, but really isn't? And if she's been able to educate herself in virtually any area that interests her, does that mean that there are some areas that interest her where she tried to educate herself but just wasn't smart enough? The reflexive use of these hedges was brought home to me when I met a colleague at a conference who I hadn't seen in a number of years, and I asked how she was doing. And she pulled out a picture of her 4-year-old daughter, and she said, "We virtually adore her." Why the compulsive hedging? Well, there is a saying in bureaucracies that one must always CYA, cover your anatomy. And there is an alternative in classic prose, an alternative slogan, "So sue me." That is, it is often better to be clear and possibly wrong than muddy and, as the physicists say, not even wrong. Also, classic prose counts on the cooperative nature of ordinary conversation. We could never have a chat unless we interpreted each other's language in context in a charitable way. So if someone says that in recent decades Americans have been getting fatter, you don't hold them to the proposition that every last one of the 340 million citizens of the United States have all been getting fatter. You interpret it in context as a general trend or on average. A second feature of classic prose is to keep up the illusion that the reader is seeing a world rather than just listening to verbiage. And that illusion can be shattered if a writer just doles out one cliche after another, leading to the advice well worth remembering: avoid cliches like the plague. I'm sure we're all familiar with a kind of writer who puts together words like, we needed to think outside the box in our search for the Holy Grail, but found that it was neither a magic bullet nor a slam dunk. So he rolled with the punches and let the chips fall where they may while seeing the glass as half full. It's a no-brainer. The problem with writing in cliches is that it either forces the reader to just turn off her visual brain and process the language as blah, 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 blah. Or if she does pay attention, then she'll inevitably be derailed by the ludicrous imagery, because if you write in cliches, you'll inevitably mix your metaphors. As in this sentence from a letter of recommendation that I received: Jeff is a Renaissance man drilling down to the core issues and pushing the envelope. Not clear how you can do all of those at once. Or from there's a quote that appeared in the New York Times: "No one has yet invented a condom that will knock people's socks off." And such writers will also be eligible for membership in Awful, Americans who figuratively use literally. Now, it's fine to say she literally blushed. It's not as good to say she literally exploded. And it's very, very bad to say she literally emasculated him. Classic prose is about the world. It's not about the conceptual tools with which we understand the world, and as such it minimizes the use of meta-concepts, that is, concepts about concepts, like approach, assumption, concept, condition, context, framework, issue, level, model, paradigm, perspective, process, role, strategy, tendency, and variable. Words that when you get into the habit of professional writing, you lose the ability to talk about anything. You always have to talk about the such and such assumption, concept, condition, context, and so on. Example, this is from a legal scholar writing in the New York Times. "I have serious doubts that trying to amend the Constitution would work on an actual level. On the aspirational level, however, a constitutional amendment strategy may be more valuable." Which is to say, I doubt that trying to amend the Constitution would actually succeed, but it may be valuable to aspire to it. Or this one from an email I got. It's important to approach the subject from a variety of strategies, including mental health assistance, but also from a law enforcement perspective, by which he meant we should consult a psychiatrist about this man, but we may also have to inform the police. Classic prose narrates ongoing events. We see agents performing actions that affect objects. Non-classic prose tends to thingify events and then refer to the thing, using a dangerous tool of English grammar called nominalization, that is, turning something into a noun. So instead of appearing, you make an appearance. Instead of organizing something, you bring about the organization of that thing. Helen Sword, an English scholar, calls them zombie nouns because they kind of lumber across the scene with no conscious agent actually directing the action. And they can turn prose into a night of the living dead. For example, participants read assertions whose veracity was either affirmed or denied by the subsequent presentation of an assessment word. That is, the people read sentences each followed by the word true or false. Or subjects were tested under conditions of good to excellent acoustic isolation. To wit, we tested the students in a quiet room. It isn't just academics, though, who write in zombie prose. It's also politicians. When Texas Governor Rick Perry was faced with a hurricane that threatened the Republican National Convention, he said, right now there is not any anticipation that there will be a cancellation. That is, right now we don't anticipate that we will have to cancel it. And just to be nonpartisan, here we have an example on the other side of the political spectrum. Secretary of State John Kerry, during the last spring's Mideast peace negotiations, said, "The president is desirous of trying to see how we can make our best efforts in order to find a way to facilitate." Translation, the president wants to help. It's also corporate consultants. A journalist recently asked a man what he did for a living, and he replied, "I'm a digital and social media strategist. I deliver programs, products, and strategies to our corporate clients across the spectrum of communications functions." And when he pressed the man finally said, "I teach big companies how to use Facebook." And it's also product engineers. Portable generators used to carry a warning sticker that read, "Mild exposure to CO can result in accumulated damage over time. Extreme exposure to CO may rapidly be fatal without producing significant warning symptoms." Yeah, whatever. And as a result, every year, hundreds of Americans would asphyxiate themselves and their families by running portable generators indoors. More recent models carry the following warning: using a generator indoors can kill you in minutes. So classic prose can literally be a matter of life and death. Literally. Well, how can an understanding of the design of language lead to better writing advice? Another contributor to zombie prose is the overuse of the passive voice. The difference between "the dog bit the man," an active sentence, and "the man was bitten by the dog," a passive sentence. It's well known that the passive voice is overused by academics. On the basis of the analysis which was made of the data which were collected, it is suggested that the null hypothesis can be rejected. And lawyers. If the outstanding balance is prepaid in full, the unearned finance charge will be refunded. 3 passive verbs in 1 sentence. And political officials. Some of you may remember this woman, Janet Pearson, formerly the director of the Secret Service, in charge with ensuring the safety of the President of the United States. Here she is testifying in the Senate as to how it was that a man armed with a knife managed to climb over the White House fence, walk across the White House lawn, let himself into the White House, climb up the stairs until he was finally noticed just outside the president's bedroom. And she said, mistakes were made. The infamous politician's evasive passive. Not surprisingly, all the traditional manuals warn writers away from the passive voice. Strunk and White, for example, wrote, "Use the active voice. The active voice is usually more direct and vigorous than the passive. Many a tame sentence can be made lively and emphatic by substituting a transitive in the active voice for some such perfunctory expression as there is or could be heard. Now, do you notice something a little fishy about this advice? Yes, it uses the passive voice to tell writers not to use the passive voice. George Orwell, in his famous essay Politics in the English Language, the other bit of writing advice that is handed out to pretty much every freshman in the country in composition class, wrote, "A mixture of vagueness and sheer incompetence is the most marked characteristic of modern English prose." He wrote that in 1946, so it shows that some things don't change. I list below various of the tricks by means of which the work of prose construction is habitually dodged. The passive voice is wherever possible used in preference to the active, a bit of advice that contains not one, but two instances of the passive voice to tell writers not to use the passive voice. So what's going on? The passive could not have survived in the English language for 1,500 years if it did not serve some purpose. Why can't we do without it? The answer comes down to the very design of language. You can think of language as an app for converting a web of thoughts into a string of words. The writer's knowledge can be captured in a semantic network, a kind of mind-wide web. This would be an example of a simplified semantic network that would capture a person's knowledge of the tragic events brought to the stage by Sophocles in his play Oedipus Rex. It contains a number of concepts: Laius, Oedipus, kill, Jocasta, mother, story, play, and so on, and a bunch of conceptual and logical relations linking them, doer, done to, looks like, is, about, and so on. Now, what happens when the writer wants to communicate a part of this network to another person? Well, then he's got to convert it into a sentence, and a sentence is a linear string of words. In Sophocles' play, Oedipus married his mother and killed his father, left to right on the page, early to late in speech. That means that there is an inherent problem in the design of language, namely that the order of words in a sentence has to do two things at once. On the one hand, it's our code for meaning, for who did what to whom. Oedipus killed Laius has a different meaning than Laius killed Oedipus. At the same time, it necessarily presents some bits of information to the reader before others, and thus affects how the information is absorbed. In particular, the early words in the sentence naturally link back to the topic, to what the conversation has been about so far. That is, in the metaphor behind classic prose, what the reader is generally looking at. The later material is the sentence's focal point. It's what the reader should now notice. And any prose that violates these principles is going to feel choppy or disjointed or incoherent. And that brings us to the passive. The passive voice is a workaround for this problem of language. It allows writers to convey the same ideas, namely who did what to whom, while varying the linear order. In particular, it allows the writer to start the sentence with the done to or the acted upon rather than the doer or the actor. And that's why avoid the passive is bad advice. In fact, it's impossible advice, because here we see the two most revered experts on style unable even to state the restriction against the passive without using the passive. The passive is actually the better construction when the done to or the acted upon is currently the target of the reader's mental gaze. Once again, let me illustrate that with an example. This is a paragraph taken from the Wikipedia entry for Oedipus Rex, which summarizes the crucial turn in the plot where the tragic backstory is now being revealed to the audience. A messenger arrives from Corinth. It emerges that he was formerly a shepherd on Mount Kithaeron, and during that time he was given a baby. The baby, he says, was given to him by another shepherd from the Laius household who had been told to get rid of the child. Now, this passage contains three passives in a row, and for good reason. As this bit of the plot summary begins, all eyes are on the messenger. A messenger arrives from Corinth. And so the next sentence should begin with the messenger because he is our focus of attention. And thanks to the passive voice, it does. He was given a baby. Well, now we're looking at the baby, so to speak. And so the next sentence should begin with reference to the baby. And again, the passive voice makes that possible. The baby was given to the messenger by another shepherd. Well, now another shepherd has come onto our mental stage. Anything that we're going to learn about him should be in a sentence that begins with the second shepherd. And again, thanks to the passive voice, it does. The other shepherd had been told to get rid of the child. Now, imagine that we followed the advice to convert passives to the active. Here's how the passage would read. A messenger arrives from Corinth. It emerges that he was formerly a shepherd on Mount Kithaeron, and during that time someone gave him a baby. Another shepherd from the Laius household, he says, whom someone had told to get rid of a child, gave the baby to him. Now, I think you'll agree that this is not an improvement. We've got characters that kind of parachute in out of the blue. Our attention is yanked back and forth because the passive isn't used to link the done to the preceding context. More generally, English syntax provides writers with constructions that vary order in the string while preserving meaning. Oedipus killed Laius. Laius was killed by Oedipus. It was Laius whom Oedipus killed. It was Oedipus who killed Laius, and so on. So writers must choose the construction that introduce ideas to the reader in the order in which she can best absorb them. Well, that brings us back to the original puzzle. Why is the passive so common in bad writing? The reason is that good writers narrate a story, advanced by protagonists who make things happen. Bad writers work backwards from their own knowledge, writing down ideas in the order in which they occur to them. So they begin with the outcome of the event, because they know how it turns out, and then they throw in the cause as an afterthought. And the passive voice makes that all too easy. Well then, why is it so hard for writers to do this? Why is it so difficult to use language to convey ideas effectively, given that the language provides us with the resources that we need? The best explanation is a psychological phenomenon sometimes called the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge refers to the fact that when you know something, it's extraordinarily difficult to imagine what it's like not to know it. Psychologists also call it mind blindness, egocentrism, and hindsight bias. And a classic experimental demonstration comes from a study that I think of as the M&M study. Should be familiar to anyone who's taken introductory child psychology. So here's how the experiment works. A 3-year-old child is brought into a room, sits down at a table. The experimenter hands him a box of candy, say an M&M's box. The child is invited to open it and opens it and is surprised to find that instead of containing candy, it contains ribbons. The box has been tampered with. So the child's surprised, and the experimenter then puts the ribbons back in the box, closes the box back up, puts it in the table, and says, well, now another boy is going to come into the room, Jeffrey. What does he think is in the box? And the child will say, ribbons. That is, he can't imagine what it's like for someone else not to know something that he knows. And in fact, if you ask the child, well, what did you think was in the box when you came into the room? And the child will say, ribbons. They can't even reconstruct the state in which they themselves were ignorant of a fact that they now know. Now, we adults, of course, outgrow this limitation. Kinda. A little. Sort of. Because many studies have shown that adults, too, are victims of the curse of knowledge. People who know an obscure word assume that everyone else knows it. If a student knows an obscure fact, they just assume that it's common knowledge. And likewise with technical skills. In fact, the more experience someone has in using a gadget like a smartphone, the less time they estimate it will take someone else to learn it. It just seems so obvious to them. I believe that the curse of knowledge is the chief contributor to opaque writing. It simply doesn't occur to the writer that readers haven't learned their jargon, don't know the intermediate steps that to them seem too obvious to mention, can't visualize a scene that is currently in the writer's mind's eye. And so the writer doesn't bother to explain the jargon or spell out the logic or supply the concrete details. even when writing for their professional peers. Now, there's a lazy excuse for opaque writing, which is, well, I'm writing for people just like me. It would be patronizing or insulting or condescending to spell things out. I can just assume that they know what I know. However, in reality, because of the curse of knowledge, it doesn't work out that way. And I find myself repeatedly baffled by articles that are explicitly written for the likes of me by my professional peers. Again, I'll give you an example. This comes from a journal called Trends in Cognitive Science. It's one of those journals that is designed to allow people to keep up with research in their own field by summarizing bodies of research in an accessible way. And this is from an article on the science of consciousness. The slow and integrative nature of conscious perception is confirmed behaviorally by observations such as the rabbit illusion and its variants, where the way in which a stimulus is ultimately perceived is influenced by post-stimulus events arising several hundreds of milliseconds after the original stimulus. Now, I've been in this business for more than 35 years, and I had never heard of the rabbit illusion. I mean, I teach illusions, I teach perceptual psychology, but I had no idea what they were talking about. And I know what the word stimulus means, but I have no idea what they're talking about. And this explanation of the rabbit illusion leaves it every bit as much of a mystery. So I went to my bookshelves and I found in a book an explanation of something called the cutaneous rabbit illusion, which works as follows. A person closes their eyes, sticks out their arm. The experimenter taps them a few times on the wrist and a few times on the elbow and a few times on the shoulder, and it feels like a continuous set of taps running up the length of your arm, kind of like a hopping rabbit. So that's why it's called the rabbit illusion. Well, there is nothing more that is inherently more scientific about using the word stimulus than using the word a tap on the wrist. And there's nothing more scientific about talking about a post-stimulus event compared to talking about a tap on the elbow. In fact, not only is it not more scientific, it's less scientific, because with such a vague and abstract description, you have no way of evaluating the strength of the argument. In this case, the idea is that because your perception of where the early taps are felt depends on the later taps, it means that consciousness does not track events in real time, but it is updated or edited after the fact to make your experience more coherent. Okay, well, now I understand it, but why couldn't they have said that instead of stimulus this and post-stimulus that? And in fact, when you know concretely what the rabbit illusion consists of, as a scientist, you're in a better position to evaluate it. Does it really show that conscious perception is slow and integrative, or might there be some simpler explanation? My favorite reminder of the perils of mindless abbreviation and jargon comes from an old joke. A man walks into a Catskills resort and goes into the dining room, and he sees a bunch of retired Borscht Belt comedians sitting around a table. So he joins them. And one of the comedians shouts out, 37, and the rest break out into uproarious laughter. Another one says, 112, and again, uproarious gales, peals of hoots of laughter. And he can't figure out what's going on. So he asks the guy next to him. He says, what's happening here? And the guy says, well, these old timers, they've been around each other for so long that they all know the same jokes. So to save time, they've given each joke a number. And now all they have to do is say the number, and they know what the joke is. And the guy says, that's ingenious. Why don't I try it? So he calls out, 43. Silence. Tries again. 81. Everyone stares at him. No one laughs. So he sinks back down to a seat and he asks the guy next to him, what happened? What did I do wrong? The guy said, it's all in how you tell it. Well, how do you exercise the curse of knowledge? The traditional answer is to always keep in mind the reader over your shoulder. That is, try to imagine your reader, put yourself in his shoes, get into his head, try to see the world from his point of view. Now, I think this is good advice as far as it goes, but it only goes so far because we're actually not very good at guessing other people's knowledge, even when we try really, really hard. None of us has extrasensory perception. So a better solution is to actually get a reader, a representative reader, and show them a draft of what you wrote, and you'll be surprised to find that what is obvious to you may not be obvious to anyone else. Or you can wait until enough time has elapsed that the draft is no longer familiar and show it to yourself. If you're like me, you will find yourself saying, "What did I mean by that?" Or "That doesn't follow." And all too often, "Who wrote this crap?" And then one should rewrite, ideally, a number of times with a single goal, namely making the prose understandable to the reader. Finally, how should we think about correct usage, about which words and constructions are right or wrong? Now, some usages clearly are wrong, are grammatically incorrect. When Cookie Monster says, "Me want cookie," the reason that even 3-year-olds are amused is that they know that Cookie Monster has made a grammatical error. Similarly, "I can has cheeseburgers." The humor in lolcats, such as it is, depends on our condescending judgment that the typical cat will make a grammatical error. Is our children learning? Even former President George W. Bush admitted that this was a grammatical error in a self-deprecating speech in which he poked fun at himself for all of the grammatical gaffes that he had made in press conferences and speeches. But other matters of usage are not so clear. And again, to be bipartisan, I'll give you an example from a Democratic president. When Bill Clinton was running for office in 1992, one of his campaign slogans was, "Give Al Gore and I a chance to bring America back." Now, purists would say that he has made a grammatical error. It should be "Give Al Gore and me a chance to bring America back," an example of the despised "between you and I" error. Another Democratic president, Barack Obama, recently said, "No American should ever live under a cloud of suspicion just because of what they look like." And again, the purists would say that this is an error because the plural pronoun "they" is being forced into concord with a singular antecedent "no American," the so-called singular "they" error. To boldly go where no man has gone before. Some sticklers would call out the split infinitive in Captain Kirk's declaration. The Beatles, for you youngsters. "You think you lost your love? Well, I saw her yesterday, eh? It's you she's thinking of, and she told me what to say, eh?" Preposition at the end of a sentence. Some of you may remember the suave, urbane, articulate 1970s talk show host Dick Cavett. Well, writing an article for the New York Times about his college reunion, he wrote, "Checking into the hotel, it was nice to see a few of my old classmates in the lobby." Any of you spot the grammatical error in that one? Yes, the so-called dangling participle. Checking into the hotel, the subject of that, the missing subject of the participial phrase should be identical to the subject of the sentence according to that rule, whereas in fact the subject of the sentence is it. Well, disputed usages like this have given rise to what journalists like to call the language war between the prescriptivists on one side and the descriptivists on the other. The prescriptivists are those who prescribe how people ought to speak and write. They are also known as the purists, sticklers, pedants, peevers, snobs, snoots, nitpickers, traditionalists, language police, usage nannies, grammar Nazis, and the gotcha gang, according to whom rules of usage are objectively correct. To obey them is to uphold standards of excellence. To flout them is to dumb down literate culture, degrade the language, and hasten the decline of civilization. On the other hand, we supposedly have the descriptivists who describe how people do speak and write, according to whom rules of usage are just the secret handshake of the ruling class. The people should be liberated to write however they please. Now, I think there are many reasons to think that this is actually a pseudo-controversy, regularly ginned up by journalists. If it were if these were really coherent positions, then prescriptivists should insist that the lyrics to She Loves You should have been It's you of whom she's thinking, which seems unlikely. And descriptivists would say that there is nothing wrong with I can has cheeseburger. Surely we need a more sophisticated way of thinking about language than this dichotomy. So what are rules of usage? They are not logical truths that you can prove the way you can prove the statements in predicate calculus. Nor are they officially regulated by dictionaries. It is not the case that every once in a while dictionary editors get around a table and pass legislation on which word senses and constructions are correct. And I can speak with some authority here because I'm the chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary. And when I joined the dictionary, the first question I asked the executive editor was, so how do you guys decide what goes into the dictionary? And his answer was, we pay attention to the way people use words. In other words, when it comes to what's correct and incorrect in English, there's no one in charge. The lunatics are running the asylum. So what are rules of usage? They are best thought of as tacit evolving conventions. Now, a convention is a way of doing things that has no inherent advantages other than the fact that everyone is doing it. So paper currency is an example. There's nothing that's valuable about a green piece of paper with a president's head on it other than the fact that everyone else treats it as valuable. Or driving on the right. There's no particular advantage to driving on the right or driving on the left. But there is an advantage of everyone doing it on the same side. There's another old joke about a man who's driving to work on the freeway and he gets a cell phone call from his wife. And his wife says, be very, very careful, honey. I've been listening to the radio and they said that there's a maniac driving on the wrong side of the freeway. And he says, one maniac? There are hundreds of them. But unlike conventions like paper currency or traffic laws, the conventions of language are tacit. They emerge as a rough consensus within a community of careful writers without explicit deliberation, agreement, or legislation. And they're evolving. The consensus may change over time, as it did with the verbs to finalize and to contact. So should writers follow the rules? The answer is it depends. Some rules just extend the logic of everyday grammar to more complicated cases. So what's wrong with Is Our Children Learning? As I mentioned, George W. Bush recognized that this is a grammatical error. Microsoft Word's grammar checker flagged it with the green wiggly line as a grammatical error. Why? Because the question, is our children learning, is based on the declarative sentence, our children is learning, and everyone would agree that our children is learning is ungrammatical. Here's a slightly more complicated case. The impact of the cuts have not been felt yet. And again, the grammar checker packaged with Microsoft Word flags this as an error, and it might take a second or two to realize why it's an error. Namely, the subject of the sentence is impact, and the verb have is inappropriate as a plural verb with a singular subject. If I were to write the impact have not been felt yet, that just jumps out at the page as a grammatical error, and so the impact of the cuts have not been felt yet upon reflection must also be a grammatical error. What the writer has done here has been distracted by the plural noun that just happens to be adjacent to the verb, so he's made the verb agree with the noun immediately before it instead of having it agree with the subject of the sentence. Also, some words in their generally accepted senses make important semantic distinctions. If someone were to give you a nice compliment, it would not be a good idea to thank them for their fulsome praise, because fulsome does not mean full, complete, copious. It means unctuous, insincere, attempting to flatter. And so you might be insulting someone who you meant to thank. Likewise, if something is elegant and parsimonious, you generally shouldn't call it simplistic. Simplistic is not a fancy schmancy word for simple, but it means naive or childlike or overly simple. And if you think something has a great deal of merit, you are well advised not to call it meretricious. You can go home and look it up if you are unclear as to why. If you use fancy words as a kind of hoity-toity synonym for more familiar words in an attempt to sound posh, you're likely to elicit the reaction of that Vizzini got in The Princess Bride when he kept using the word inconceivable to refer to things that just happened, prompting Inigo Montoya to say, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." On the other hand, not every pet peeve, bit of grammatical folklore, or dimly remembered lesson from Miss Thistlebottom's classroom is a legitimate rule of usage. And indeed, many supposed rules of usage turn out, when scholars track them down, to violate the grammatical logic of English, to be routinely flouted by the best contemporary writers of English, and have always been flouted by the best writers of English. Singular they is an excellent example. A couple of years ago, there was an angry article that appeared in the Weekly Standard in which the purist author claimed that singular they was a barbaric construction that was forced down our throats by radical 1970s feminists because it offered a gender-neutral way to refer to something, and that we should all instead ignore these angry feminists and go back to the plain, austere writing of Jane Austen. Whoops. Turns out that Jane Austen herself used singular they 87 times in her writing, as in everybody began to have their vexation. And if you have a problem with a sentence final preposition, then maybe you should go correct William Shakespeare when he wrote, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on." And the same is true of split infinitives, dangling participles between you and I. It turns out there is nothing wrong with those alleged errors. In fact, obeying bogus rules can make prose worse. It's not just that it doesn't make it better. Here's a sentence that appeared in a recent Harvard press release. David Rockefeller has pledged $100 million to increase dramatically learning opportunities for Harvard undergraduates. Now, the writer of this sentence tried so hard to avoid a split infinitive, to dramatically increase, that he wrote a sentence that belongs to, I'm not sure which language, but it isn't English. In fact, obeying bogus rules can literally bring on a crisis of governance. Literally. In 2009, Barack Obama was administered the oath of office by Chief Justice of the Supreme Court John Roberts, who was a notorious stickler for grammar. He would return all of his associates' legal briefs with all the grammatical errors circled. And when it came time for Roberts to administer the oath of office, what he was supposed to have said, according to the wording in the Constitution, was, "I, Barack Obama, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States." Now, Robert must have thought that this contained an illicit split verb, and so he unilaterally amended the Constitution, abandoning his strict constructionism, and had Obama say, "I, Barack Obama, do solemnly swear that I will execute the office of President to the United States faithfully." Now, not only is this not an improvement over the language of the framers, but it called into question the legitimacy of the transfer of power, and so they had to repeat the oath of office in the White House in a private ceremony that afternoon, split verb and all. So how should a careful writer distinguish the legitimate rules of usage from the bogus ones? The answer is unbelievably simple. Look them up. If you look up split infinitive in, for example, the Merriam-Webster dictionary, what it will say is, it's all right to split an infinitive in the interest of clarity. Since clarity is the usual reason for splitting, this advice means merely that you can split them whenever you want to. In Carta, there is no grammatical basis for rejecting split infinitives. American Heritage Dictionary, same thing. Random House Dictionary, same thing. Modern dictionaries and style manuals do not ratify pet peeves, grammatical folklore, or bogus rules because they are based on evidence of the best practices of English's best writers. including in contested cases, usage notes that describe the controversy. And in the case of the American Heritage Dictionary, the one that I consult for, presents the results of polls among careful writers as to whether they would use or would accept a particular usage, allowing the writer to make a judicious choice. So they're not a kind of backup for smarty pants one-upmanship or a way to settle barroom bets. Also, though I think that correct usage should be a concern of a good writer, it has to be kept in perspective. In fact, I think that rules of correct usage are the least important part of good writing. They pale in importance behind maintaining classic style, ordering ideas in a coherent manner, and overcoming the curse of knowledge, to say nothing of factual diligence and sound argumentation. And even on top of that, the most irksome errors are really not signs of the decline of the language, to say nothing of civilization. And this point is brought home by a panel from the XKCD webcomic strip by Randall Munroe, in which a purist is visited in the middle of the night by a ghost who brings a cautionary vision of things to come. This is the future. And this is the future if you give up the fight over the word literally. And yes, they are exactly the same. So in sum, I've suggested that modern linguistics and cognitive science provide better ways of enhancing our writing. A model of prose communication, namely classic style, in which language is a window onto the world. An understanding of the way language works, in particular the way it converts a web of thoughts into a string of words. A diagnosis of why good prose is so hard to write, that is the curse of knowledge. And a way to make sense of rules of correct usage, namely that they are tacit, evolving conventions. Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Any interrogatory verbalizations?
Please, I'll just help you out, moderate. People aren't intimidated, surely.
Surely not. Yeah.
How much editing do you do?
Do I do?
Yes.
For my books, I generally put a book manuscript through 6 drafts, not counting corrections I make as I write, going back over every sentence as I write it. Then it goes to the copy editor, and then it goes through several more rounds of much more punctilious attention to things like punctuation and errors that the copy editor finds. Between drafts 2 and 3, I'll generally is when I get feedback from readers, both kind of a peer review of experts in the subject matter and more general readers, including my mother, who I bring up, by the way, not in the academic sense of a mother as an unsophisticated reader. My mother actually is a sophisticated reader, but she just happens not to be an experimental psychologist.
In your book, The Language Instinct.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Quentin Regestein. In your book, The Language Instinct, you recommend a book of writing by somebody named Williams called Towards Clarity and Style.
Yes, style
and
towards, yes.
And you say it comports with modern language science. But you have written this book.
Yeah.
And so there must be some improvement. I notice in your booklet that it has cartoons by Calvin and Hobbes, and he did not. But perhaps you can say what impelled you to, what made you feel another book such as this was needed?
Yes. So the Joseph Williams book called Style, and Toward Clarity and Grace is the subtitle, is an excellent book, and it's the only it was the only how-to manual that was based in any advice, any research from linguistics and psycholinguistics. And what was especially valuable about Williams' book is that it dealt with units of language about beyond the sentence. It talked about coherence and structure in paragraphs, in essays, and so on. And I owe a great deal to Williams, and I do call him out for thanks in the sense of style. Well, Williams, the first draft of the book, he's since passed away, and there are a number of other some of his colleagues at the University of Chicago have updated it. It's still, it used some of the work on discourse coherence that was around at the time. I think the first draft was written in probably the early 80s, maybe even the late 70s. But I think there's been a lot more since then that could be incorporated. There were also the only other book on style that was in any way informed by linguistics and cognitive science was the one that I mentioned in this talk, Clear and Simple as the Truth by Turner and Thomas. And all the insights of classic prose were not available to Williams. There were just I thought it was time 25 years after his book came out, for something that was a little more updated and a little more. Williams wrote with a lot of wit and lack of pretension, which I liked, and that was a style that I also try to emulate myself. So I was inspired by him, but I thought there was more to say. I don't think he had the last word. But I think that people can read more than one manual, and I think Strunk and White is still worth reading if you take some of what they say with a grain of salt. And it's a short book; you could read it in an hour or two. And I think Williams is well worth reading. So I think that writing is a craft that one can always improve. And just as people who specialize in any pastime, in cooking or photography, often will read lots and lots of books and magazines, and I think the same is true of writing. It's a lifelong calling to improve the craft. Yes?
Hi, thanks for the great talk, Helen.
Just, since we're being recorded, would you just
Oh,
use
yes.
the mic, please? Thank you.
Hi, Helen Farrell. Thanks for the great talk. I was curious what your advice would be to young aspiring writers who are kind of trying to craft their skill in terms of, do you have a preference amongst the following? One, encouraging writers to produce large volume and just sending it out there to see, who picks it up, versus two, having small volume but perfecting the writing?
Well, certainly perfecting the writing has to be foremost. That is, this is really a case where quantity does not make up for quality. The advice I would give, aside from consulting some of the manuals, I have to add that most of the really skilled writers that I know never picked up a style manual. So there's a little bit of humility into what I can accomplish by writing one myself. But what they all do is they all have immersed themselves in reading. That, I think, is a universal among skilled writers. And they savor good writing themselves. They stop and linger over passages that just give them pleasure, or that seem to be a paragon of the art. And I think, I don't know how consciously, but I encourage people in the very first chapter of the book to get into the habit of reverse engineering good prose. When you come across something that is well written, stop and ponder why it's well written. What are the tricks that the writer seems to be doing? And I think that is, I begin the book with a chapter of where I do that for the reader. I go through 4 passages that are quite diverse in style and content, and I think aloud on the pages, saying, well, why does this sentence work? Well, think of the way this word sounds and the way the sound reinforces the meaning. Or look at the meter of that sentence. Look how, even though it's a passage of prose, it reads like poetry. It's got a nice, pleasing rhythm. Or think about that image, or notice how the writer avoids a cliche, or notice how the writer uses parallelism. The two sentences in a comparison are identical in syntax, just varying the word that the writer tries to contrast. So I think good prose has hundreds of tricks like that, which couldn't possibly be listed one by one. It would be tedious to read them all. You learn often by appreciating the work of the masters. Also, a lot of what goes into competent writing, I think, consists not in having memorized a lot of rules, because they're just too many of them, they're too tedious, but with enough of a history of reading, certain errors just pop out. Just because if you've immersed yourself in the world of edited prose, you just you develop expectations as to what it should look like. And many of the errors in inept writers come not from flouting some kind of logic, but rather following logic all too assiduously, but in violation of the irregular, illogical conventions of the printed page. So if a writer spells the verb to lose with 2 O's, or if they talk about the book and its cover and they spell its with an apostrophe, or they say you're right and they have an apostrophe in your, they're not being illogical. It's actually not so easy to state why you shouldn't do those things, given the regularities of English. But English isn't perfectly regular, and if you spend a lot of time reading, you just know that they're wrong. They just jump out at you because you've seen so many examples. And so becoming a competent writer, including a competent speller, competent at grammar and at punctuation, often comes from just sheer massive exposure because it's so irrational. And in the final chapter of the book, I go over a number of the irrationalities that have been baked into English, including a lot of punctuation rules that are, you can understand why people make errors with them. They don't make any sense, but that's just the way it's done. And you appreciate that through raw exposure.
Hi, great. Thank you so much. My name is Mike Fox, I'm a neurologist. There's a big push in evidence-based medicine, so not going off of necessarily expert opinion or going off of a few examples, but going off of scientific study of what are the relevant principles for a big end. And I wonder, has that been done in writing? In other words, you gave a lot of very salient examples where you can say, okay, clearly that's clearer than this other piece of prose. And you give a lot of examples of good writers and what they do. And so has this been systematically studied where you take little snippets of writing that vary these rules and find out what are the properties that lead to higher rated clarity, and then you can follow them knowing that this is the property that really is the most important, followed by this one, followed by this one?
Yeah, not in as much detail as would be optimal. There are studies from composition instructors. There are studies from the psycholinguistics lab as to what makes a sentence ambiguous or hard to parse. And I tried to incorporate them when they existed. But I was frustrated to find that a lot of them, those studies, can help with sentences that are downright confusing. How to avoid sentences that where you can't figure out what they mean, but aren't as helpful for the difference between plodding, dull, turgid prose and lively, enjoyable prose. There we really don't have systematic studies that vary the variables and see which ones are effective. And it would be nice, I agreed, to have more of them. One advantage of writing, the subject of writing compared to medicine, where the lack of the equivalent of clinical trials or random assignment. We can get away a bit more without them just because the effects, as opposed to, does the patient walk with a limp 6 months after the operation? The effects are, in this case, the reader's reaction, and all of us are readers. So we, in seeing a sentence, have I think a pretty unanimous judgment that is a clunky sentence and that's a much clearer alternative. And that intuition, unlike the intuition of what works or doesn't, it is that intuition that you're trying to tap with the writing. And so there's a sense in which all of us are subjects in a clinical trial as we read and as we digest the advice. But in general, I would have liked for some of the advice that I gave to be validated in that kind of evidence-based way.
Great talk. One question I have is sort of about Justin Baker. I'm with CLPB. A question about sort of how people use certain styles of, say, academies to sort of link them culturally with a certain group of people.
Yeah.
And sort of make themselves sort of a rightful part of a group. And I guess I wonder about use of plain English in a academic paper might, to some, make you seem sort of not worthy of the audience that you're talking about. And I wonder what you think about this, either as how do you motivate academics to speak more clearly, write more clearly, and is there a risk for them to do that? And if not, is it a delusion that they're experiencing, and how do you think about that?
Yeah, there is some signaling that's going on in bad prose. That is that you're notifying your peers that you belong to the club, that you know some of the jargon, and I think the problem is that when that comes at the expense of clarity, it just defeats the purpose of writing in the first place. And that the self-advertisement, I really am a serious member of the guild, is not really a defensible motive. Whereas clarity really is a defensible motive. Also, I think people do tend to exaggerate the extent to which it is mandatory. And Helen Sword, who coined the term zombie noun, wrote a book called Stylish Academic Writing, and inviting the joke, oh, it must be one of the thinnest books of all time. But she analyzed 500 academic articles from 10 different fields. And she found that, contrary to the idea that the gatekeepers insist on bad writing, she found that in every field but one, you could find maybe 10 to 15% of the articles were actually written in a kind of lively, conversational, clear manner. And I certainly know that in my field, some of the most revered psychologists were fabulous writers. B.F. Skinner, George Miller, Gordon Allport. The one field that was medicine, and that the exception. And although there was a reason, it was not because medical researchers necessarily want to sound turgid or opaque, but that in many medical journals that she examined, there was a rigid template where every paragraph was pretty much stipulated by the requirements of the journal, and so it allowed no freedom for more lively expression. I just spoke to my wife, who's at an academic conference, Rebecca Goldstein, who's a novelist and a philosopher, and she's quite familiar with everything that's in the book, and was a reader for it. And this was a conference of literary scholars. And she said, "Oh, you were far too generous. They really are writing to sound opaque and to dress up the fact that they have nothing to say."
Hi, I'm Lee Cranberg. Who are your favorite writers?
Oh, I have a lot of writers that I enjoy, and I highlight some of the book. I think we have now a lot of really good science writers. I think we're in a golden age of science writing, and Richard Dawkins, Atul Gawande. Why am I blanking on his name? Brian Greene, Robert Sapolsky. Many philosophers have reached out, Dan Dennett, Colin McGinn, John Searle, and our fine stylists. There are many essayists that I like, Clive James, Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens. There would be a long list. I also single out in the chapter in which I pick 4 passages of prose to reverse engineer. Isabel Wilkerson, who's a professor of journalism at BU, who wrote a wonderful book on the great migration of African Americans from the Deep South to northern cities between the 2 world wars, The Warmth of Other Suns. I mentioned Rebecca Goldstein from her book on Spinoza. I call it one of the obituary writers of the New York Times, Margalit Fox, for the quality of her obituaries. John Mueller is a political scientist who's written on the history of warfare and on international relations. He was one of the inspirations for my own book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, on the decline of violence, and as well as being a original thinker, he's a fine stylist, and I highlight an example of his prose. And I, like many of you, spend time during the summer on Cape Cod. I don't know if any of you in the Orleans area have picked up a tabloid called the Cape Codder. Well, in there's a column called Ask the Bird Folks, written by a guy who owns a store that sells birdseed. And he got Mike O'Connor. It's the Birdwatchers General Store. If any of you have been to Orleans, it's just after the traffic circle on 6A. And he got so many questions from customers about birds that he decided to try his hand writing a column. And the column's called Ask the Bird Folks, and it is factually rich, it is witty, and it is beautifully written. And so I give an example of coherent prose that comes from a question he fielded on great blue herons. So those are just a few examples.
Eric Anderson. I do not like writing, but I have to make myself do it for work. Do you enjoy writing, or if you don't, do you have any strategies for rewarding yourself to actually do it?
Right. You know, I am like a lot of writers say, I enjoy having written, and and I think that I think that does capture it for me. I actually don't. I enjoy revising a lot. I don't know if I enjoy getting the first draft down. I find it, I mean, my main strategy, rather than going downstairs for Ben & Jerry's, is my main reward is that my anxiety level goes down a bit after I've written a few paragraphs. And so it's really, for me, it's a battle of accomplishment versus anxiety. And the real sense of pleasure and pride often comes in the revision. Often because the first draft is really not good at all. I just don't feel I've accomplished anything until I've reworked it, and then it feels like a piece of writing. Now I know but people differ. I know that there are columnists and bloggers who, to my amazement, seem to be able to get it down pretty much in the first draft. I once had lunch with the syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Some of you may know, a conservative columnist for the Washington Post. And he wrote to me later in the afternoon. He said, the lunch with you was so intellectually stimulating. I got such a workout that when I got back to my office, I wrote my column in 20 minutes, and then I felt I had to take a nap. That's how tired he was. That 20 minutes, you wrote a whole column, 20 minutes? So there are people who can do that. I suspect that Atul Gawande can do that. Most of you probably can't, and I can't. So I think in terms of, you also ask for advice. I think that, as with anything, if you try to make it good, then there is some pleasure in the degree to which you succeed. And if you separate the writing into two stages, the drudgery of getting it down on the page, and then the polishing, the honing, the improvement, the kind of stepping back, looking at it, and saying, well, how can I make that better? That, for me anyway, that's the part that's fun. And if you set it for yourself as a challenge, can I make it better? I think there's some pleasure in that.
Ming Tong. I did a lot of medical review and editing for the pharmaceutical industry in terms of their, periodic safety review for the drug. And I generally agree with what you said, for simple prose writing. But do you realize, there are some other kind of writing? People, they purposely introduce ambiguity. In our literal world, for people, they get the Nobel Prize in symbolism writing. The bear. There have been a very famous, books, hanging around. Even the recent Nobel laureate in China, he learned from that kind of quote unquote, ambiguity writing. So how do you see, the significance of precise, writing versus, people they try to introduce a metaphoric, implication in their writing.
Yes, no, I think that's an excellent point. A classic style is only is one style. It's a style that I think the largest number of us would aspire to, in the sense of, if we write an article, a review, a blog post, a lecture, it's often classic style that we sense as the difference between a lively, clear, well-written passage of prose and something that is dull, turgid, opaque, professionalese, whether it be medicalese, legalese, academese, and so on. So that's why I focused on classic style. But you're right that there are, for one thing, there are practical styles where the writer's goal is to serve a reader's need. The reader is, unlike the metaphor in classic prose, where the writer has noticed something interesting in the world and wants the reader to see it, in practical style, the reader has a need for a particular kind of information, the writer is supplying it. And many, so the medical research articles that fit a fixed template would be an example of practical style as opposed to classic style by necessity. And likewise, the kind of writing that you mentioned that you engage in would be another example of practical style. So not all of the advice behind classic style necessarily applies to practical style, but they do overlap. There are certain, the styles are not disjoint either, and some of the principles apply to both. When it comes to more creative writing, and for that matter, when it comes to a lot of everyday conversation, there is sometimes strategic ambiguity. If I say to at the end of a nice dinner to a woman, "Would you like to come up and see my etchings?" That is strategically designed to be not clear. And in fact, I've written a number of papers as a psychologist of language and a book on the deliberate use of euphemism, innuendo, in order to cultivate plausible deniability. So that's one sphere in which a good writer will, and diplomacy often requires a calculated ambiguity so that both sides can get to yes. And then, of course, literary writing, poetry or evocative prose, stream of consciousness, all of those differ in certain ways from the model behind classic style. Often there are layers of interpretation. The more meanings you can get out of a single sentence, the more deep, rich, evocative it is, and that's not what classic style is about either. On the other hand, I think that because those other genres differ from clear prose in certain calculated ways, understanding what goes into classic prose gives the creative writer more insight as to what they're deliberately flouting in order to achieve their effects. I think stream of consciousness, for example, which is by definition not classic prose. Classic prose is about showing an objective reality to someone who can see it with their own eyes. That's exactly what you're trying not to do with stream of consciousness, where you're trying to use language to externalize something that is ineffable and private. And many of the forms of stream of consciousness are strategic negations of certain things in classic prose, because the intent is the opposite of classic prose. So even if you don't write in classic prose, I think knowing what goes into it can be helpful.
So we have time for 2 more questions. Is that suitable?
Absolutely, yes.
Hi, Nan Doyle. Do you think there's any correlation between how well a person can write and how well they speak?
Often, not always, partly because with speech you don't have the luxury of unlimited revision. It has to come out in a particular order, and you can't hit the delete key. And so I think there are writers who are more fluid than they are in speaking. And there are probably clear speakers who can get away with a lot of the charity that you can apply in speech, but that don't work on the printed page. In fact, all of us, I mean, I sometimes succumb to the temptation, or to the lure, maybe I should say the lie, of speaking invitations that come with a requirement to submit a written version of the talk. They say, well, we'll make it easy for you. We'll hire someone to transcribe your talk, and then you just to kind of touch it up, and there you've got your written version. And it's shocking how unlike written prose the spoken word is. That there are a lot of ungrammatical examples that kind of fly by the ear in speech, but that jump out of the printed page. There are transitions that make sense in speech that don't work on the page, and so I find it's almost a complete rewrite when I have to change a transcript to an essay. And I think that there are people who are quite clear in speech as a result, but if they don't know how to reorder things on the written page, it may not be as effective.
We have two more questions.
Sure.
My name's Sarah Izzo. As an undergraduate kind of scientist, I find a lot of young aspiring scientists thinking that they might not really need to be good writers, and there's kind of this attitude that my writing doesn't matter because that might be, at this point, the established pattern. So how can we change, I guess, that attitude among people who might be entering this field?
Yeah, so I think it's I think it's a fallacious assumption. That is, I think good writing really does help scientists, partly in that scientists more and more recognize the responsibility of communicating their findings to an audience other than their immediate peers. It's the population that pays for our research. They have a right to know what we find, and I think that's increasingly seen as one of the responsibilities of a scientist. But even within the scientific community, and I tell my students this, if you send out your grant proposal or your journal article and you force your reviewer to do a lot of extra work and to be frustrating because they have to read one of your sentences 3 or 4 times, they're going to be in a bad mood. That's going to hit your priority score. At least there's a good chance that it will. If they misunderstand you, if you mean A, but they think you mean B, they might think that there's a flaw in your design, and the flaw might not be there. You might have just screwed up in explaining what you did, so you're working against yourself. And there are even cases where I think literary flourishes can make a difference. I think there was one grant that I got where a long time ago, where I applied for a piece of equipment that would automate a experimental procedure that I was doing on human subjects. And I said that the experimenter, in running around was like Charlie Chaplin in modern times on the assembly line. And 2 or 3 of the reviewers kind of called that out and says, "Oh, Pinker, we really have to give him this equipment because his poor research assistants are like Charlie Chaplin on the assembly line in modern times." So I actually got some grant money as a result. So I think for all these reasons, I think it's a skill that scientists are well advised to cultivate.
I'm Trace Hattemer, a psychiatrist, and as a psychiatrist, I see people who don't know what they think and feel until they speak. Do you think that there are people who don't know that writing is how they find out what they think and feel? And do you find that you develop and expand your ideas as you write?
Yes, that undoubtedly happens, that because often words are more precise than, or different than thoughts, there are probably 10 to 100 thoughts for every word, and words often have multiple meanings, and it's often only when you write it down that you sometimes realize that you didn't know which among several thoughts you meant. On the other hand, an interesting aspect of classic style is that the goal is to make your writing read as if that is not the case, even if it is the case. That is, in classic style, it should not look as if you're using the occasion of writing to sort out your thoughts. Classic style consists of the thought coming first and the writing being purely a way of expressing a thought that the writer had before putting pen to paper. Now, that's a fiction, but that's okay. The idea is that you conceal your tracks, you retrospectively edit your own history, and you write it as if it was perfectly clear from the get-go. Kind of like the celebrity chef in the TV studio who kind of pulls the perfect casserole out of the oven without any of the mess. And that's because all the assistants have kind of prepared it behind the scenes, out of sight. Now, there is, to be sure, some tension there between the ideals of scientific presentation and classic prose. That if, post hoc, you make it seem as if you predicted the result all along, after you know what the result is, that can be bad science, but good prose. So there is that trade-off. You can't, in scientific writing, you can't lie and say, well, we did it because we knew the result would come out that way, after you know the result and you edit the history. On the other hand, a lot of really bad writing and amateurish writing consists of sharing with the reader more than the reader really wants to know about your own history of bumbling and false starts and blind alleys and fool's errands and so on. And there's a trade-off as to when you make how to make prose read more coherently, and that sometimes does mean some retrospective telling the story so it leads to what actually happened. But of course, without flouting the canons of scientific honesty, of retrospectively making a post hoc finding seem a priori.
So thank you.
Great. My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.